Ladies and gentlemen, boys and ends, welcome to Red Alert 2's review. I am joined, as always, by Mr. Dynamo. What's up, dude?
Hello, I'm here with a new microphone.
Yeah, he's not a quiet man anymore. It's a spectacular turn of events. So,
I'm
go ahead.
I'm glad that we were able to complete this game like in a relatively short order. So we'll now begin the review.
Hell yeah.
And if you want to make an introduction on what do you think the main topics will be, or I can just start talking about it. Like it's up to you.
Well, we wanted to first start off with just sort of like the history of the franchise or some like our personal histories with it. And all I can really say on that topic is this is my first time ever playing this game, unlike Dynamo. This is my first time actually playing all of the games. Like this year is when I had first started or had any exposure to the first 4 released Command and Conquer games, which were Red Alert 1 and 2 and Command and Conquer 1 and 2. And other than that, my experience with the game was playing Command and Conquer 3 and Red Alert 3. So the worst games of them all, of the entire franchise. Besides maybe Generals, although I have no experience with that game. That also looks like a real train wreck. And I guess the 4th game is technically a game, so maybe that's also the worst?
No, it's not. It's not
okay.
a game.
All right, well, glad we could square that away. Thanks for correcting that fake news. But yeah, so I've played like some of the 3D ones, and I think one time I played like a demo or something of the FPS game, Renegade, I think it's called. So yeah, that's my history with the franchise overall. People who already like have heard or like watched the videos and heard me talk about that know that this is the first time I've been experienced or exposed to this game and experienced it. But yeah, you on the other hand have had a much more storied legacy with this franchise. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, in fact, my very first time playing Command and Conquer games was when I was about 3 years old, believe it or not.
Of course.
And my first games, I guess I should mention all of them at this point. The first games I ever played, I don't know which one exactly it was, but it was one of 5. Commander Keen, which is a platform game, Doom, Duke Nukem in 3D, Warcraft 2, and Command and Conquer Red Alert 1. These 5 games were actually the very first games I ever played. I don't know which of the 5 it was, but definitely Red Alert is up there. Like I was playing this game even before I knew how to control a mouse, basically. So I just got annihilated on the first mission. But I played Red Alert 2 a few years after it came out. I want to say I played it in about 2003 or 4, whereas the game came out in about 2000, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And the expansion was 2001.
And I definitely remember enjoying it a lot back then. I didn't really even speak English at the time, but the game never came out in Italian. But I was still able to understand the objectives and the briefings, even though the game version I had didn't have any cutscenes, which was true of every other game I had at the time, including Warcraft 2, for example, which didn't have any cutscenes when I played it. But yeah, so let's talking about Red Alert 2 specifically. The thing that it did for the genre, like in terms of theme, is the fact that it had a relatively down on earth. I say very relatively because the game is quite crazy in its tone, but it had basically a real world scenario, a real world war scenario. So basically, it featured real faction from the planet Earth. So it wasn't like a fantasy setting or a sci-fi setting where everything is invented. It sort of tried to emulate a real world feeling. And I think in that way, it was partly successful, especially since, for example, you have all these missions where there's clearly different settings and there's generally different props to show this. For example, in the New York mission, you have the very opening of the Allied mission showing the destruction of the Statue of Liberty. Or you have, for example, a mission set in the Mayan jungles where you have several Mayan temples. So I actually think the game at the time was probably one of the most faithful when it came to attempting to recreate what would appear to be a believable real-world environment. I can't really think of any other game that did that. For example, Age of Empires, which is also another franchise set in the real world, didn't really have as many props at all. But talking about my history with the game, but basically what I did at the time was I mostly played and finished all the campaigns. So this applies to the vanilla campaigns and the expansion campaigns. If you remember from the Tiberian Sun review and playthrough, I did mention that I actually never completed the game. I only completed the North campaign of the original, never completed the GDI one, and I never completed the expansion ones. So this is actually the first a game we played on Steam where I actually completed all of it. But I would say that beyond any doubt, the most popular, the most famous thing this game has done, the way it is popular, above all else, like above the PvP scene, which obviously exists for most RTS games, is the modding community, like the way the game is moddable. And this is something that we will not cover much in the review because of course we have not actually played any custom content for the game yet, at least. But this is this is the reason why it's been so popular since the beginning. As all you have to do to mod the game is basically have a notepad program where all you need to do is open the rules file and you can basically edit any sort of stat from the game. You can, for example, choose to give different weapons to different units. You can, for example, choose to give the I don't know, the missile launcher. You can choose it to give it an aircraft instead of a missile launcher. Like you can change the payload basically that a unit has. You can change the stats, and you can even create brand new units for yourself. And the file format that it uses, the archive format, it's very easy to mod as well. Tools for that have existed since basically the beginning. So you can create as many units and as many weapons and super weapons or whatever as you want. There is no real limit in that regard, which is very nice. And many projects in the franchise, like many projects for this game are quite old. They've been around for well over a decade at this point, but not many of them have seen release, as some of them were simply way too ambitious for their own good, which is something that unfortunately plagues a lot of the modding communities for many games. But yeah, the claim to fame for this game is definitely like what guaranteed its long-term life. Like the fact that so many people even today play it. You get, for example, hundreds of people playing PvP in a mod for this game is definitely the way the game is so moddable. This is just has been a huge advantage for people deciding to create custom content for an RTS, which is something that only a few other games allowed to, and no other game did it to the same extent as this did. So even back then, I used to play mods for this game. Like I used to play the older versions of Mental Omega, for example, before they rebooted all of it. And eventually, I just started drifting away from the vanilla experience. I never really played vanilla anymore for a long, long time. I just used to play modes like Mental Omega or Eagle Red or Robot Storm, just to name a few. So this playthrough has actually been a blast from the past for me, as I have never actually seen the vanilla game in action in a long, long time. And so there were many things I forgot, many things I saw again. And yeah, it was definitely a nostalgic experience for me, but also I have to say it was not nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be, and it was a definitely improvement over the other games. And I would say, at least from a personal perspective, that compared to a lot of other RTS games, as I have played quite a few, not finished many, but definitely tried out many, this actually has one of the more reasonable campaigns of any commercial product, which I don't know if it's a point of advantage for the game or just the fact that the genre is kind of in the wrong hands. But I would say for the most part it has been an acceptable experience. It definitely had way less micro maps than any other of the other games in the franchise. I think it had like 2 or 3 per mine campaign, maybe even less. I don't remember exactly, but it definitely didn't have many. And there were also other improvements, like for example the ability to expand your base. You can build MCVs pretty much from the start of the game, almost. Like I think they are only locked in the first few missions, but after that you can build as many as you want. The interface was greatly improved, and so was your playing experience. Like you actually were able to communicate with the game much more effectively than you were before.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I guess this is a good opportunity to throw the discussion back at you. Like, do you think, like, how do you think about this? How do you think the game managed to convey its themes and manage to improve over the previous games? What do you think of that?
Well, I think that one thing that is probably something that is just always been a standout of, well, maybe not always. This game and the previous title, Tiberian Sun, both had this point in their favor, insofar as when you were in a new location, you kind of knew it. Like, Tiberian Sun maybe less so, because I do remember a lot of the maps looking the same. And of course, the first two, like, I really count Red Alert as almost an expansion pack of the original Command & Conquer, because it's just very similar in terms of the engine and how everything looks. It looks just
like,
more like
the
a reskin.
graphics are mostly the same.
So what I would take away from that is, you know, the environments there. I think there were 2 different tile sets we saw in the first Command & Conquer game, for example. Maybe there was a third one, but like very, very limited in terms of the visual storytelling opportunities. Whereas the developers saw that, and I think they greatly improved it with the Command & Conquer 2. But with Red Alert 2, they definitely improved it insofar as you do have that element of like the props are different. And that was the first thing that, I mean, beyond all of the interface changes that I knew just from playing a couple of skirmish games to make sure that the game was functioning properly, that alone was definitely a pretty big, like they kind of led with it. They made sure that you knew that they were putting some effort, at least into the beginning of the game's characterization when it comes to those environments. And I thought that that was an important thing to, you know, sort of exemplify right away, because this would give something of a consistent look to the idea, like, this is going to be something that is happening a lot in this campaign or in this game, and we want to lead with that. And so people will start to look for that sort of thing. Like, I think there were even different civilian building models depending on which tile set you were in or which location you were in. And that I thought was really, really good, because that shows you that there was some effort put into cultivating a different feel for each environment. And just as a bit of a jump off point for something that you said earlier about the modability, where there are no limitations, for example, to the data in like how many unit entries or you know, doodad entries or anything like that you can have. I think that's an interesting point to make, just because it's kind of like the developers knew that they needed a really, really high, like, upper limit for a number of entries for certain things, because they were going through the effort to make all of these art assets, because they were going through the effort to make all of these new units, these different, you know, doodads or like civilian buildings and the Statue of Liberty, for example, and like all of the other different set pieces that they needed for the campaign's story and for their environments. They realized there's no way that they could have like a limited engine in that sense. Maybe that was not a problem ever since the engine upgrade from Command & Conquer 2, but for me, it was really, really refreshing to see something like that, not just because it led to a better end user experience of really being able to put, you know, tell the environments apart and really feel like you're in there in a different way, but in the modding side, like that made me sort of know, like, if I ever wanted to mod this game, or just anybody who was modding or wanted to mod this game would have a much easier time for something as basic as just adding a new unit, where they wouldn't have to replace an existing one like you have to do in StarCraft, for example, which is what I'm a lot more familiar with. So I think that that's like the developers accidentally maybe doing that. Maybe that was a deliberate thing that they thought, like, oh, let's make sure that we can do that so that we can have this, you know, unlimited modability and we can ensure longevity. But I don't actually think that most developers were thinking about that. That seems more like an accidental, like, or maybe a bullet point or something at the end of the day, where they would be like, you know, yeah, we can spin this as, you know, this great engine is able for, you know, available for other people to mod it. I don't think that was necessarily a significant mindset going into it, but it certainly was the end result. And that's one of those things that I really do appreciate as both a modder and a player. Like, I like the fact that there's now custom content for me to play in this game, where before I never really considered custom content in other RTS games, just because I had not been exposed to it. But obviously Mental Omega is quite large, and that would be the biggest one of the bunch. But as far as this game goes by itself, while I don't think that the resources were tied in as well as Tiberian Tiberian Sun, where there was like an entire, like, almost sub-faction of neutral hostile units that were like the mutants and stuff, where they had like the mutant dogs and the mutant everybody else, like those electrifying units, whatever those were. Those were built into so those are built into the environments a lot, and made the terrain and the resources feel like they were really a part of the gameplay, because they were in this case, and they had more gameplay impact. I don't necessarily mind that walking over gold doesn't kill my fucking infantry, but I do like that there was a little bit more of a deference for that in the previous title that we played, whereas this one obviously didn't have that to the same degree, which I think it would have been easy and trivial to add stuff like that. Like, maybe you could have, you know, found some gold miners or something as like a neutral faction. It might seem a little goofy, but the whole fucking game is goofy. So you could have had those guys, and maybe you can blow up if you destroy their gold trucks, it spills out gold everywhere, and then you can mine that. sort of like blowing up the mutants spilled out Tiberium in the previous title. Something like that I thought would have been a fine way to go about still keeping some vestige of that environmental interactability that rewards players with resources that they can then go mine, and add a little bit more interactability to the resource system. Whereas obviously this game, Red Alert 1 and 2, both had less interactivity, less gameplay around that than their Command and Conquer like streamlined counterparts did, where the first and the third games had a little bit more to say about that. But yeah, I think as far as the environments go, they were definitely put together better and to a higher standard, a more consistent standard of quality than the previous titles have been. And I am appreciative of that. What I will say, though, is despite the fact that the game's environments are put together better, I do think that perhaps the game went a little too goofy when it comes to the unit design. Something that always rubbed me the wrong way about some of the units was that they definitely were not afraid, at least, to have some very wacky conceptual units, like the Prism tank that just shoots giant beams of light everywhere and stuff. And some of like the other units, like obviously all of the naval units are psychotic, and of course they bring back dogs, but they're even more goofy in some ways, and you can have spies turn into dogs, and that was more like a funny little extra bit, as opposed to being something that was a core feature. It was just something that happened in one or two missions. But I don't know, there's something that rubs me the wrong way about some of the unit concepts and some of the unit designs. And while you did say that at the beginning of the review that the game was more so well grounded in that sense than some of the other RTS games have been, and while I agree with that, I definitely feel like that flew in the face of it a little bit. And I'm not necessarily trying to stifle the creativity, but I would have liked to have I guess I would have liked the story to have justified the existence of those units a little bit more, and the setting to have justified it as well. Whereas I don't want, a really lengthy briefing that goes over the, technical details of what a dolphin is and how it gets equipped with sonic radar or whatever the fuck it's using to blow up ships and disrupt giant squids. Like, I don't need all that information, but something to, maybe there could have been a mission where we actually had to, like, secure some dolphins or something. Like, I don't know, every concept that I can think of sounds really silly, obviously, but something where it would have helped ground the identity of that unit as it pertains to our faction would have been a bit better, I think. Whereas, like, it's just thrown at you and said, hey, now you have this unit. And, like, that's sort of how a lot of other RTS games have done it. And I don't even think it belongs necessarily in those kinds of contexts. Like, obviously the basic corollary is like just being able to train siege tanks and Goliaths now in one of the Terran missions or something. But like, you'd think that there would be a little bit more, hubbub about having access to new technology, and it wouldn't just be now you can train this unit, or not even telling you like StarCraft does it. But I thought that, that was a point of contention for me, is that, and it's sort of related to the art, because that's the first thing that you see, and that's what you mostly remember about it, alongside its gameplay impact, is that I felt like the factions were designed in such a way where it started out sort of grounded, and the more high-tech it got, sometimes the weirder it got, especially in the expansion, where everything was even more psycho. And I think it's okay if things are psycho, but you sort of have to lay the groundwork for the psycho to be acceptable, and they didn't do that here. They just sort of, like, they wanted both a serious undertone to some of it and a grounding to some of it, but also to go full psycho without the sort of like the consequences of going full psycho in an otherwise played straight setting. And I don't know, maybe they weren't thinking about it at all. Maybe they were just like, oh, this is kind of tongue-in-cheek and kind of funny, and like, oh, he's got giant squid, wow. But I still thought it, oh, a flying saucer, oh, a moon mission. Like, I don't know. It's, as funny and enjoyable and sometimes cool as the concepts ended up being, I still feel like at the end of the day, they sort of broke that immersion in a little bit, where you were aware that the concepts were ridiculous, as opposed to you feeling like, in retrospect, yeah, those concepts are ridiculous, but in the moment, and even in retrospect, they still felt like they belonged. I don't know. It's a kind of a squirrely distinction to make, but hopefully you guys understand what I mean.
Yeah, I actually get it. And it's interesting that you mention all this, because Mental Omega actually sort of rectifies this a little bit, in that many of the units, like the same units that are in this game, although most of them have had a redesign, they're actually introduced a little bit more. For example, in the expansion, there is a unit for the Yuri faction, which is basically a giant mind-controlled tank, which is sort of tutorialized in one of the moon in the single moon mission, where you actually get it to see in action in the opening cutscene, so you understand what it does. But there's actually a mission in the Mental Omega where you actually start with one of those units, and there's actually a factory producing them, and you have to use the unit to get back the factory and get the base building back online using that unit. So they actually try to fit the units more into the story, basically, which I guess is what you were trying to say. Like,
Yeah,
that's sort of the idea. So that in fact has been a concept that modders have experimented with, and I would say has been successful. And so it definitely means that it would not have been out of place for the developers to attempt it, basically. So I can definitely see why that would belong in the game, as you said it should.
yeah. Well, it just feels like something that you would expect out of a game where a lot of it is about teching up to the next level and getting a better, option for warfare against your opponents. And these units fit some sort of combat role. I will criticize the tech tree insofar as some of the units do feel like they're kind of pointless or very niche, and not even in ways where it's like sometimes this unit can be an appropriate response to an enemy comp. It's more like the Dolphins hard counter a specific interaction with squids fighting boats. Like that is so niche, but so like that is pretty much the only way to deal with them in a reasonable manner, that the inclusion and the relationship that those units have is actually pretty toxic to naval gameplay in a situation where naval gameplay is already pretty much of a gimmick. And so like I guess we can just get right into that now, actually, because outside of that specific example, I do think that there are other examples of certain options being a little too niche and a little too like hard counter where like certain units will always win out against other units. And then there's some examples of some units being clunky to use, like the Apocalypse tanks, but I guess they're designed to be that way. It's just that it doesn't feel great for that kind of relationship to be there with the unit, where the player has less control over an Apocalypse tank compared to a standard Scorpion tank or any of the other tanks, because the Apocalypse tank's the only one that can't fire on the move. That was sort of like, maybe the Mirage tanks also can't fire on the move or something, but they have like that weird cloaking thing, so at least it's offset there, whereas the Apocalypse tanks, the only difference is that they're just stat boosted otherwise, so...
Well, they also can attack air units, which is a big advantage. But yeah, I can definitely see that some units definitely feel like they are too niche.
Right.
But at the same time, I feel like again, this has been a blast from the past for me, because, for example, Mental Omega overhauled every single unit and made them fit a more specific role instead of having, for example, a tank being able to annihilate everyone once he became elite. But yeah, I feel like some of the units are meant to feel a specific role, but they end up just being, in general, very good against everything. Because the thing is that with the veterancy system in this game, unlike the previous game, where, to be honest, it may as well not have had veterancy. I don't think we saw it, but we may as well not have. It didn't really leave an impact in any way to the gameplay. Whereas in this game,
it was ancillary, yeah.
In this game, they really made veterancy overpowered, and I guess they thought it was funny and cheeky, and like it was cool to have this super power tank just blowing away everything. But I think it actually took away a lot from the gameplay. You basically had times where enemy units became veteran or elite, and you suddenly were not able to interact with them anymore with the same unit composition you were able to interact with. And at the same time, you had the situations where the prism tank, that you mentioned, which is meant to be an artillery unit, but once it becomes elite, it basically destroys every single type of unit in the game except for flying unit. So I would say when it comes to unit balance, like, the game would actually work a lot better without veterancy in this case. Like, I don't even necessarily mind the idea of veterancy in that you want to make a unit stronger by just being on the field more. Like I'm fine with people not finding this concept good, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad concept. I think it can be executed well. But in this case, veterancy means that the unit actually becomes something different than what it is meant to be. Like, it kind of violates the role that it has in unit compositions. And and the way this happens is through removing interaction at the end of the day. So you basically have a situation where once elite, the units basically become good against every single other unit in the game, which is sort of exasperated by the fact that a lot of the buildings and units just have very little health,
Right.
which
Yeah.
I don't think is a bad thing. Like, if
No.
that's
Yeah.
what if that's what you want to go with, absolutely, that's fine. But I think just removing veterancy or just making it way less powerful would have made the game significantly more interactive. And especially since in the end, veterancy mostly works in your favor. The enemy is rarely capable enough to exploit them to their full advantage. So I would say that this has definitely been the main weakness of the game in terms of gameplay, just the fact that veterancy simply makes everything so powerful and removes unit variety and interaction. But I'm guessing you agree with this analysis. But if you have anything to say on this front.
Well, I definitely think veterancy in this game was way overblown. I actually don't know how you would incorporate it in a way that is beneficial to the gameplay loop. The best RTS game, or rather the RTS game with the best inclusion or best take on veterancy was Armies of Exego, where the first, like the human faction, when their units leveled up, they got a small aura that improved armor. And it was not like a massive one. It was like 0.5 or 1.5 armor or something. So it wasn't really that big of a deal, but it was some reward for keeping a unit alive and microing well. I think something else was... Oh, yeah, so the Horde race, or the monster race, could revive their veteran units, and they cost the same as a normal unit of that type. So you could spend the same money but get a slightly buffed up man with, like, you know, slightly better stats. Basically, like the same thing as having one level of upgrade. And the Zerg type race just basically used leveling up as their upgrades. So they would build a single structure which would collect all XP gained. And rather than units individually getting bonuses as they themselves got veterancy, that was applied to all of them as basically an extra upgrade level once it had gotten to a certain point. So all of these instances, you'll see veterancy is not a big deal. It's very minor. And that's actually my main critique of it, is like, why include it at all if it's just going to be tantamount to getting an extra upgrade level through a different means. Like, I guess it adds something different than actually upgrading, but to me it just feels like
it's basically what Tiberian Sun did, more or less, where it didn't really have much of an impact, and for the most part you didn't even notice it was there. So yeah, again, it's a case of it being extremely minor, and I could definitely see it being questioned for its usefulness in this sense. But yeah, it definitely is, for example, something that mods have tinkered with. For example, Mental Omega has made veterancy to be on the same level as Tiberian Sun, more or less, where it's much harder to obtain. You need to kill way more units for it to be effective. And even when you do get it, like, I think the main benefit is that you get a slight speed boost, so the units are slightly faster, but it doesn't really, even so, translate to anything particularly meaningful.
Yeah,
So,
and I don't think it needs to be included is the problem. Like, I haven't seen anybody put veterancy into a game where veterancy improved the experience for players and for player agency and for skill expression. Like, there has never been a point where you were rewarded for doing standard RTS things, but you were like rewarded. Basically, veterancy is just, hey, you did something you were already supposed to do by keeping your unit alive. Here's a reward. It's like, the reward is just having the unit. Like, why do I need an extra buff? That would be like if I was never supply blocked and the reward was giving me more extra supply or something. You know what I mean? It's just layering some extra advantage on something where the result is already in my favor because I'm microing well, or I'm keeping myself not supply blocked. It's like, in that case, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing anyways. You don't need to reward me further than what the game already rewards me for. And in that sense, I've never seen anybody include veterancy in a positive way, because the fundamental way that you include veterancy is just that. It's completing some task that you're already completing. The only other thing would be like if you had to walk around collecting stuff like in StarCraft 2 co-op or something. That's just like a gimmick, bonus objective that has nothing to do with actually playing an RTS. So that's like another example, but it's taken the other way, where rather than rewarding you for doing what you're already doing, it's rewarding you for doing something that you would never do in any other context. There's never really a middle ground where it adds something different to the gameplay experience, but it does so without becoming a gimmick, or without feeling like a gimmick, or without making you do something that you wouldn't want to do if that reward wasn't already there. So I understand that it's like a sort of a mindfuck for developers to try to figure out how to include it properly, and how to include it in such a way that it's not exceedingly either useless or useful, and it doesn't morph engagements in that way, but it also still is useful and worth the effort. You don't really have any instance of that otherwise. Like you have no positive middle ground really, and as a result, I would just tell developers to eschew it entirely and never include it because there's no reason to. In this game, it was definitely too much.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And well, is there any point off the top of your head you want to discuss on the game?
Oh yeah, so
Maybe...
like the next thing that I was gonna bring up was
Sure.
After we were done talking about the whole tech tree stuff and the veterancy is, I wanted to talk a little bit about the a fundamental way that that naval combat is also kind of a gimmick in the same way that veterancy is, where I've never seen an RTS with naval combat execute it well. I've seen it where players can become skilled at it, but it's testing in such a way where you have to facilitate all of the maps that have naval combat such that your investment into your naval units are not wasteful. So if you have an investment and say you spend like 5,000 resources, which is actually a very modest amount, even though it sounds like a big number. In this game, that's like that's like 5 ships or something, or like 3 ships, depending on which ship it is. But you say, for the sake of argument, you have 5,000 resources invested into your ships, and you need your ships to be at or above the 5,000 investment marker in order to pass through the enemy units. With some micro, you can do it, and you'll lose a couple, but you'll still have, say, 3,000 left over because 3. And now this 3,000 credits investment that you have after you've accomplished the goal that you had to accomplish with naval units is no longer useful for you at all, because that's the only water combat in the entire game in this particular map. That happened so many times in the campaign where it was a combination of the fact that naval combat by itself is almost always a gimmick, and a combination of that, like that combined with the fact that the map design did not actually facilitate naval combat usage. You couldn't even really use like the bombarder type naval units because they just had flying units that would come and eviscerate you, or everything that was possible to attack was out of the reach of those naval units. So there was never any point for you to actually become a good naval combat player and express your skill in the campaign. And even in the missions that were more heavily reliant on that, it was still at some point a waste of investment, because now they're just sitting there doing nothing, not contributing to your war effort anywhere else. And they literally can't. Like, I guess you could put them in your dock and sell them potentially. I didn't even try that. But that's pretty much the only way you can do it. And at that point, like, I don't understand why you wouldn't just design a game where, you know, you're not forcing the player to sell their own units after a certain point. I don't know what you think about this. I know you've played more games with naval combat in them. Maybe you can speak to one that is a little bit more reasonable in that respect. But I have never seen a good one. I've never seen a good take on it.
Well, I actually agree with your analysis overall, but like you said, this analysis applies mostly to the campaign. And in the campaign, everything you said is actually correct. When it comes to something like PvP, while some of what you said is correct, in PvP, you actually want to keep water control. So having water units around is useful at all times, not just in this game, but also in games like Warcraft 2 or Age of Empires 2, for example, which also is big on naval combat for maps that have water. But you want to keep the naval control, because if you destroy the enemy navy and then you give up the water control, then the enemy can take it back and turn it into their advantage. No, you could argue that this in itself still constitutes a gimmick. I'm not gonna necessarily disagree with that, but I would say that the main reason, like the way naval combat is made useful, is by basically keeping it a constant part of most of the game. Like having it something that applies to the early game, applies to the late game. It can be used for sneak transports in the early game. It can be used for long sieges from the water in the late game. And this is something that happens in a game like it can happen in PvP, but it cannot happen in the campaigns because, for example, like we actually played a bunch of maps that are naval combat, but most of them didn't even require you to do it. For example, in the expansion, there is the map that has 3 landing spots for your navy to land, and you can decide to play the rest of that map as a naval war, but you can also choose to ignore navy entirely. You can actually get your entire fleet destroyed and just destroy the naval shipyard with your land forces, which is the main objective of the mission. It is actually what you ended up doing. I think the campaigns only really had, at least in the original game, one map where you were forced to play as naval, whereas most of the other maps simply gave you a choice. on one hand, it reinforces your idea that it kind of feels like it's not really an organic part of the game if you can choose to ignore it completely. And on that note, I would like to add that I'm pretty sure this also applies to vanilla, but at least in Mental Omega, there is the option to disable naval combat entirely, even for water maps. So it definitely is something that's it's not like Red Alert 3, for example, which is a game you play that relies heavily on naval combat. Like it's a part of the game you cannot do without. Whereas in this game, that's definitely not the case at all. You can choose to ignore it for nearly all of the missions. So I don't feel like it was actually that big of an element in the game. But I will say this in regards to the Navy in Red Alert 2 specifically. And what I will say is that most of the really unusual and I want to say clunky units in the game actually are the naval units.
Yeah.
And this is not because naval combat is necessarily clunky. It's just by design. For example, the Allied ship is the main combat ship, the destroyer. It has a gun that it uses for normal combat, and that's reasonable. But the way it fights submarines, which are generally going to be its main opponent, is by using a aircraft that fires rockets. And this aircraft has a fairly long reload time, and it can be shot down. And I don't necessarily disagree with this being a thing. I just feel like for a unit, it feels very, very clunky to use effectively. It's not as maneuverable and as instant to use as what you would want as a main combat unit, like a tank, for example, or a marine or something. So I feel like this also applies to the giant squid. Like the giant squid was a unit that was had countered by the dolphin, but it felt really annoying to fight against when you actually fought against it. But when you actually had it, like it was almost useless. Like it didn't really help you in any way. It had a really, really low damage value. Like it was useful maybe in stopping aircraft carriers from firing immediately, but it still is a very nice role. And I still maintain that it's not a unit that is very easy to use effectively. Like I just feel like the main issue with naval combat in this game is that they just use the weirdest of all the unit concepts for the naval units, and so it ends up being way worse than it would otherwise have been if they just had stuck with a more, I don't know, even more generic, I guess, unit composition for Navy. And it definitely is the worst aspect of the naval combat in this game, in my opinion. Whereas the core gameplay, the core naval combat is actually worse in a game like Warcraft 2, for example, where you actually have a naval resource. Like you have to extract oil with naval extractors. So this has the side effect of meaning that if you lose the water in a PvP game, you don't really have the option of gaining it back because the enemy is going to have a monopoly on all the oil platforms in the sea. Whereas this game doesn't have that. So it actually, the naval combat is generally a better core. It just doesn't really feel very, very comfortable and very fun to use with the really strange and bizarre unit comps that they decided to go for naval units specifically. Right. So I think that's my analysis overall on naval combat in general and on this game specifically.
I would just say that one thing to talk about, I actually think that one way to make naval combat a little bit more worthwhile is if you were able to reward the player for taking control of the waters, even in a campaign mission where obviously your AI enemy is, at least in this case, like in most cases, it's not going to be that much of a challenge, and it certainly isn't going to be the same challenge as if you're playing against a player of your own caliber, of your own skill. You'd have to play up to that skill in order to beat him, most likely, or beat the other opponent. So my idea for that, I would just say, is that what you could do instead is you could add resources. You could add some sort of, maybe even a neutral structure that were on islands. That was pretty much the only way that they did it, or expansions that were on islands. But why not just have it so that, something like, I guess in Red Alert 3, harvesters were able to be, go on water or something. I think they also deployed into outposts. But at the very least, rather than the latter, you could make it so that harvesters could go on water, and that way you don't have to make a new unit just for this purpose. And then you can extract some of the resources there. And that, I think, would have been totally reasonable. I don't understand why they didn't do something like that. They already have gems as a secondary resource that, I mean, they all only have one resource type insofar as they have credits. But they have two different resource things, the gems and the gold, the ore, that you combine those two, and they both go into the same resource anyway. So I don't understand why they wouldn't be able to do
they
something
could
like
have
that.
expanded the concept definitely.
Yeah, and I think that definitely would have helped, I think, in my opinion, justify the fact that they included naval combat, especially when you take into account that they did have all of these clunky units that weren't really very fun to use at all. But
right,
yeah, I think that puts the can on that anyway.
Yeah, well, I guess the other major point I wanted to discuss, although it's kind of a discussion, I guess, on what we have played in general, as finishing the Red Alert 2 game concludes the official 2D Command and Conquer series. So in that sense, it is a bit of a milestone, I guess you could say, like for the channel. And I guess we can analyze the mission design and the level design, comparing it to the previous games and comparing it to other recent campaigns you've played. And this is something I mentioned at the beginning, but I really feel like it should be mentioned again, that these are way less micro maps than the other games in the franchise. Like, it is on one hand sad that they had to wait 3 games before they realized that micro maps are not really something worth messing around with, but finally they realized it, and it definitely paid off. It resulted in a much more enjoyable experience on that front. But unfortunately, it still is one of the very few games that have done this, and even one of the few custom campaigns to have done this. Like, in the sense that custom campaigns generally have way more micro maps than official ones. Like, that's what I mean. So, I guess, in a sense, it is a good perspective in that it helps. Like, if we take these videos as educational value, I think the benefits of having macro are evident even when watching something like this. Like, you were allowed to use way more strategies than you were able to in one of the endless timed micro maps in Red Alert 1, for example, or like those really strange train maps in Tiberian Sun. Like, there was way more effort put into player decision. Like, there was way more choice given to the player. Even in the naval combat itself, like, you could choose to have naval combat or you could choose not to have it. Whereas in micro maps, you're simply segued into a single type of gameplay. One of that, on top of it all, is also lacking in terms of what you can actually do with the game, in terms of player's choice. So, what do you think of this aspect? Do you think it could serve as a warning for other developers or just modders, or do you think it's a case where it doesn't really matter and developers will still see micro maps as the way to make the game more varied in the review? Like, what is your view on this topic?
I feel like we discussed this in one of the other reviews, but in case, well, either way, it bears repeating. But either, if you haven't heard of this, what I have to tell you right now is, on this topic, there are a lot of developers who feel like their campaign or their video game isn't varied enough. If I want to play an RPG map, I will play an RPG. I'm not going to play a map in an RTS that tries to be an RPG. Nor am I going to play a map that tries to be an RTT, a real-time tactical, where your resource gathering and base building aren't a part of the experience. I'll just go play Company Heroes if that's what I'm after. I'm never after that, full disclaimer, but if that's what I wanted, I would go play that. So you don't need to change your game up in that way. The changes of pace should be coming from the army compositions of the enemies, the personalities of the enemies, maybe some terrain stuff can be thrown in there, like maybe there's a map with less pathways or more pathways or less resources or more resources than whatever preceded it. And you can have all those different levers to pull to make an experience, you know, decently distinguished from what you experienced before. There's no reason to have micro missions that completely change and remove features of the game without adding anything useful. So as far as trying to warn developers off, if they haven't realized by now that the only people who want a different experience than an RTS in an RTS are people who don't want to play an RTS in the first place, or don't always want to play an RTS and just haven't figured out that they should go play something other than an RTS when they don't want to play an RTS, those people are kind of helpless until they, you know, get knocked in the head and start owing somebody a beer, because there's really no way to go about designing a mission like what a micromap tends to be without overhauling the entire engine and adding a whole bunch of new functionality into it. And we've never seen anybody do that. We've never seen anybody even attempt to do that beyond a couple of very niche examples, like Chox's Eternal Death, which is soon getting a mod update that has a whole bunch of this stuff tried to implement. But even then, it's like, halfway there in some respects. You still have to use memorization of what the menus do in certain respects. Stuff like that. Like, you're never going to really get a fully fledged RPG experience in an RTS unless the RTS engine was designed such that you can actually program that. Like, paradoxically, StarCraft 2 supports an RPG more than it supports an RTS just because of the way that it was designed. Yeah. So stuff like that, maybe, but you're not going to get that kind of experience.
And if that's not a fucking warning, I don't know what is.
Yeah, that is a pretty good warning. That's like, that's like saying, that's as much of a warning away from designing micro missions as playing Legends of Arcane is a warning to never play Warcraft 3 again. So there's really nothing about that. I mean, if you had any doubts, you could just look at what else I played for Warcraft 3, and you know that you should never touch that game. So don't make micro missions. Look at Flame Knives. Never make another micro mission again. That's what I have to say on that. As far as this game and how few micro missions it had, it was more than 0, so it's too many. But I will say that the fact that there were so many improvements in the UI, there were so many improvements in my ability to control the game, not as much as I would like, and it's not as many as I would like, but we found out that there are camera hotkeys, which maybe there existed in the other titles, but we were able to use them in this one. We found out that just the way that we could order units and select them across the map, it made it kind of easy. It was like the F2 button in StarCraft 2, which I'm not really a big fan of, but I guess when you have as many units in this game as you do, then there's really no way around something like that. I guess you still could have made it so that you can't select them across the entire map, but being able to select them across the screen was nice, and being able to, assign rallies much easier, and just in general control your units much easier. We still didn't have a really easy way to attack move, unfortunately, but there were some significant improvements, and that made the micro missions a little bit more tolerable for the quick amount of times that, like, the low running time of our playthrough that was comprised of micro missions was really, really nice in that respect. And so the fact that we didn't have to suffer through them as long or as much, as numerous as the times where we had to suffer through them in the previous titles is a point in its favor. Insofar as I don't really think there are as many gimmick missions. I'm really happy about that. Certainly were still some, and pretty much all of the macro missions, with the exception of maybe a couple in the expansion, were pretty gimmicked. And so, like, just looking at our victory condition and looking at how we had to establish that and achieve that, they were pretty gimmicked. I'm obviously also not the best player, so that contributed to it. Where a better player would definitely have been able to clear some of the missions before they turned into Gimmick Central, whereas I didn't have that luxury and had to suffer through the gimmicks or restart the game with and win with map knowledge. But either way, I don't know. I think that it was an okay experience for sure. It was probably the best campaign of an RTS that I've played, and that includes custom content so far. I don't really think there has been a better one that was as lengthy of an experience while still, justifying its length, even if there were a lot of really silly gimmicks, like the final Yuri mission for the Allies, for example, was really, really silly, and just a bunch of other things. So I don't know if you have any other, I guess, closing remarks, unless there's some other large topic that you wanted to broach.
No, I think we mostly covered everything we needed to cover, and yeah, I agree with this. It definitely has been one of the best campaigns for a commercial RTS from back in the day. Obviously, we have not playing many more, so we will see, for example, how the Age of Empires campaigns compare to this when we get to those. We will see the Warcraft 2 campaigns. There is much to learn and see still, and I think, like, in general, the genre itself, as any other game genre or any type of genre, always relied on, developers seeing what other developers were doing and ideas being exchanged. So we're going to compare this game with other games we've played. We're going to see what things it did better than others, what things it did worse. If those things were done before or if they were done after this game, for games we'll play. For example, if we play Generals, we're going to compare it to that. But yeah, it definitely, I think, has been a milestone for the channel, like I said, to finally have completed the 2D Command & Conquer games. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. We will definitely, like I said, see more of this game in terms of custom content when we get around to that. And we will also see if the lessons have been learned of developers of future projects, or if other RTS games that came out in the same year or before that have tried some similar ideas as this. Beyond that, I don't really have anything else to say, I don't think.
Well, all right. I appreciate you joining me for the playthrough and further for the review, man. I think it was a nice way to send Command and Conquer off until we finally return to it for Mental Omega, which will probably be sometime next month if you're down.
Sure.
All right.
Should be good.
Cool. So, yeah, I think that concludes our talk. Red Alert 2. See you later. I'm not playing Red Alert 3 again, but I will make Dynamo suffer through Command and Conquer 4, so look forward to that.
Oh my god.